The rain and the weight of struggles. The rain showed no signs of stopping, drumming against the cobblestones and forming shallow puddles that reflected the dim streetlights of Charleston. Ben Carter's steps were slow, deliberate, as though the weight of the world rested on his hunched shoulders. His old sneakers squelched with water, the soles barely holding together after years of use. The cold seeped through his thin jacket, but the chill of his mounting worries was worse. Debt collectors' calls rang in his head like a relentless echo. His father's passing had left more than just emotional scars. It had left his family penniless, drowning in unpaid bills and bad loans. His mother's health had begun to deteriorate under the stress, her medical treatments draining the last of their meager savings. And then there was his younger sister, bright-eyed and brimming with potential, yet forced to put her college dreams on hold. Ben clutched his satchel tightly, his law textbooks pressing into his side. He had vowed to be the one who pulled them out of this abyss. But as the weeks passed, even that vow felt like a pipe dream, an unexpected call. When Ben finally reached the small, worn apartment he shared with his mother, he paused to wipe his soaked shoes on the mat. The faint aroma of soup wafted through the air, a humble reminder of his mother's efforts to keep some semblance of normalcy. His phone buzzed, startling him. Pulling it from his pocket, he frowned at the unknown number. He hesitated. Lately, unknown calls were rarely good news. After a moment, he answered. "Hello, Ben speaking," he said, his tone polite but weary. "Mr. Carter, this is Margaret Hawthorne," said a voice that was calm yet commanding. It wasn't the clipped tone of a debt collector nor the nasal cadence of a telemarketer. This was something else entirely. Ben blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, who are you? And how do you know about my finances?" Margaret's response was firm, with no hint of hesitation. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Magnolia Lounge at 7 p.m. You'll understand when we meet." Before Ben could protest or ask further questions, the call ended. He stared at his phone, his heart pounding. Who was Margaret Hawthorne? What could she possibly want? And why did her tone carry an unspoken air of finality, as if meeting her wasn't a choice but an obligation? The meeting at Magnolia Lounge. Curiosity gnawed at Ben as the hours ticked by. By evening, he found himself standing outside the Magnolia Lounge. The upscale restaurant glowed warmly from the inside, its windows offering glimpses of well-dressed patrons sipping wine and laughing softly. It was a far cry from the world Ben inhabited, a world of fast food and thrift stores. He adjusted his damp jacket self-consciously before stepping inside. The soft lighting, polished wooden furniture, and quiet clink of silverware against porcelain added to the surreal atmosphere. He scanned the room, spotting a striking woman seated in a corner. Her presence was impossible to ignore. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore an emerald green gown that exuded elegance. A string of pearls adorned her neck, each one gleaming under the chandelier light. When their eyes met, she gestured gracefully for him to join her. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her tone even and measured. "Thank you for coming." Ben hesitated, then slid into the seat opposite her. He couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in such an extravagant setting. "Mrs. Hawthorne, what's this about?" Margaret studied him for a moment, her piercing blue eyes unblinking. "I know about your debts," she said matter-of-factly. "Your mother's medical bills, your sister's stalled education, and your struggle to stay afloat." Ben's heart skipped a beat. "How do you?" Margaret raised a hand to silence him. "I have resources, Mr. Carter. I know more than you might think, but I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here to offer you a way out." Ben leaned back, his confusion deepening. "And what would that be?" Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "Marry me, a shocking proposal." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Ben blinked, certain he had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," Margaret said, her tone steady. "This isn't about love, it's a business arrangement. I will pay off all your debts, cover your family's expenses, and secure your future. In return, you'll be my husband, for appearances." Ben stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. "This has to be a joke." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice calm yet insistent. "I assure you it's not. You're young, unattached, and in need of a solution. I'm offering you one. All I ask is that you fulfill the role I need, a companion in name, a presence for my public image." Ben's mind raced. This woman, this stranger, was offering him a lifeline, but the price seemed too surreal to comprehend. "Why me?" he asked finally. "You don't even know me." Margaret smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Exactly. You're a blank slate, no ties that could complicate things, and frankly, you're desperate enough to consider it, a family in despair." That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He paced the tiny kitchen, the light from the single bulb flickering slightly. His mother sat at the table, her hands trembling as she sipped a cup of tea. "She offered to pay off everything," Ben said, his voice breaking. "She'll take care of your treatments, pay for Emily's college, even get me through law school. But marriage? To someone I don't even know?" His mother's tired eyes met his. "Ben," she said softly, "I know this isn't what you dreamed of. But dreams don't keep the lights on. They don't pay for medication or tuition." She reached for his hand. "You've carried so much on your shoulders. If this is a way to lighten that burden, maybe it's worth considering." Ben stared at the table, torn between his pride and the crushing reality of their situation. Was he truly willing to sacrifice his future for the sake of his family? And if he didn't, what then? The meeting at Magnolia Lounge. Curiosity gnawed at Ben as ticked by. The card Margaret Hawthorne had played was both mysterious and unnerving, leaving him with an uneasy anticipation. By evening, he found himself standing outside the Magnolia Lounge, a place he had only seen from a distance. The upscale restaurant glowed warmly from the inside, its windows offering glimpses of well-dressed patrons, clinking glasses of wine and engaging in soft laughter. Ben adjusted his damp jacket, the fabric clinging awkwardly to his frame. He glanced down at his scuffed sneakers, their worn state glaringly out of place against the polished marble entryway. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the wave of self-consciousness threatening to engulf him, and stepped inside. The interior was like stepping into another world, a world he didn't belong to. The soft glow of chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, reflecting off the polished wooden furniture and the pristine white tablecloths. The gentle clink of silverware against porcelain created a melody of refinement, blending seamlessly with the murmur of low conversations. The air smelled of luxury, a mix of fresh flowers, aged wine, and something indefinably opulent. Ben's eyes scanned the room, trying not to appear as overwhelmed as he felt. At first, he thought he had made a mistake. This wasn't the kind of place where people like him were welcomed, much less summoned. But then he saw her. Seated in a corner booth, Margaret Hawthorne exuded a presence that was impossible to ignore. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, catching the light in a way that seemed deliberate, and she wore an emerald green gown that clung to her with an elegance he had only seen in magazines. A string of pearls rested on her neck, each one flawless and gleaming, like a silent testament to her wealth. When their eyes met, Margaret gestured gracefully for him to join her, her movements deliberate and measured, as if she had all the time in the world. Ben hesitated for a moment, his throat dry, before making his way to her table. "Mr. Carter," she greeted as he approached, her voice as smooth and even as her demeanor. "Thank you for coming." Ben slid into the seat opposite her, feeling acutely aware of every movement, every sound. His chair creaked slightly, a stark contrast to the quiet sophistication of the setting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of his depth, an uninvited guest at an exclusive party. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he began cautiously, "what's this about?" Margaret studied him for a moment, her piercing blue eyes unblinking. It felt as though she were peeling back the layers of his defenses, reading more in his silence than in his words. "I know about your debts," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact. "Your mother's medical bills, your sister's stalled education, and your struggle to stay afloat." Ben's heart skipped a beat. The directness of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, his voice faltering. "How do you?" Margaret raised a hand, silencing him with a subtle yet commanding gesture. "I have resources, Mr. Carter," she said simply. "I know more than you might think, but I'm not here to intimidate you." Her eyes softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "I'm here to offer you a way out." Ben leaned back in his seat, his confusion deepening. A way out? From what? And why would someone like her care about someone like him? "And what would that be?" he asked finally, his voice betraying both his curiosity and his skepticism. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, calm, deliberate, and faintly mysterious. "Marry me," she said, her words landing with the weight of a thunderclap. For a moment, Ben was certain he had misheard her. He blinked, trying to process what she had just said. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," Margaret replied, her tone steady and unwavering. "This isn't about love, it's a business arrangement. I will pay off all your debts, cover your family's expenses, and secure your future. In return, you'll be my husband, for appearances." Ben stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. The surreal nature of her proposal left him grappling for words. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he knew about her, and realizing how little that was. "This has to be a joke," he said finally, his voice edged with disbelief. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her posture composed yet insistent. "I assure you, it's not," she said calmly. "You're young, unattached, and in need of a solution. I'm offering you one. All I ask is that you fulfill the role I need, a companion in name, a presence for my public image." Ben's thoughts churned. This woman, this stranger, was offering him a lifeline. But the price she was asking seemed too surreal to comprehend. "Why me?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You don't even know me." Margaret's faint smile didn't falter. "Exactly," she said. "You're a blank slate. No ties that could complicate things, and frankly, you're desperate enough to consider it." The words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Ben felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, leaving him unmoored. Margaret's proposal was both a promise and a challenge, a door he had never considered opening, now standing ajar before him. A shocking proposal. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted in that moment. Ben blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. He replayed Margaret's words in his head, convinced he must have misheard her. "I'm sorry? What?" He managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "You heard me," Margaret repeated, her tone unwavering, as though she were discussing a business transaction rather than a life-altering proposition. "This isn't about love. It's a business arrangement. I will pay off all your debts, cover your family's expenses, and secure your future. In return, you'll be my husband, for appearances." Ben's chair creaked slightly as he shifted, his discomfort palpable. He stared at her, searching her face for any hint of a joke, a trap, or even a sign of insanity. But Margaret's expression remained calm, her piercing blue eyes locked on his, unyielding and composed. "This has to be a joke," he said finally, his voice tinged with disbelief. Margaret leaned forward, her hands clasped neatly on the table. "I assure you it's not," she said evenly. "You're in a position where options are scarce. I'm offering you one. All I ask is that you consider it carefully." Ben's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling in a chaotic mess. The idea was absurd, almost laughable. A complete stranger, this wealthy, poised woman, offering him a lifeline in exchange for marriage? It sounded like the plot of a soap opera, not something that could ever happen in real life. "Why me?" he asked, his voice quieter this time, almost tentative. "You don't even know me." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, though it lacked warmth. "Exactly," she said. "You're a blank slate. No attachments, no past scandals, nothing that could complicate things. And frankly, you're desperate enough to consider it." The bluntness of her words stung, but Ben couldn't deny the truth in them. Desperation had become an ever-present shadow in his life, creeping into every decision he made, every sleepless night he endured. His mother's health, his sister's stalled future, the relentless calls from debt collectors, it was all closing in on him, and he had no way out. "But why do you need this?" he asked, his curiosity momentarily overpowering his shock. "You could find anyone to play this role. Why go through all this trouble?" Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something inscrutable passing through her eyes. "My reasons are my own," she said, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "But suffice it to say, appearances matter in my world, and I need someone who can fulfill that role without entanglements or complications." Ben exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. The weight of her proposal pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the magnitude of what she was offering, freedom from debt, security for his family, it was the implications. He would be giving up his autonomy, tying himself to a stranger, and stepping into a world he didn't understand. What would this arrangement look like? He asked hesitantly, unsure if he wanted to hear the answer. Margaret's smile returned, small and precise, as though she had been waiting for this question. We would live together, of course, but our lives would remain largely separate. I would require your presence for certain public events, dinners, and social functions. Beyond that, you'd be free to pursue your studies and your goals. Ben stared at her, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. Her offer was straightforward, almost clinical in its logic. But it wasn't just the offer itself that unnerved him. It was the cold certainty in her tone, the way she seemed so assured of his desperation, his willingness to accept. "And if I say no?" he asked finally, his voice firmer now. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "Then you walk out of here, and we pretend this conversation never happened," she said simply. "But I think you'll find, Mr. Carter, that walking away from a solution isn't as easy as it sounds when the alternative is drowning." Her words struck a nerve, cutting through the veneer of Ben's composure. She was right. He was drowning, and he had been for years. And now, for the first time, someone was offering him a lifeline, even if the terms were unimaginable. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded with unspoken thoughts. Ben felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the unknown. Margaret's gaze remained steady, her confidence unshaken, as though she already knew what his answer would be. Ben began, his voice faltering. He looked down at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap, and thought of his mother, his sister, the weight of the debts that hung over them all. The choice before him wasn't just his own. It was for them, too, a family in despair. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. The weight of Margaret Hawthorne's proposal sat heavy on his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. The tiny kitchen of their apartment felt even smaller as he paced back and forth, the soft creak of the worn linoleum floor underfoot the only sound besides the faint hum of the refrigerator. The single bulb overhead flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to shift with his movements. His mother sat at the small, chipped table, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped from a mug of tea. The steam rose lazily, dissipating into the cool air of the apartment. "She offered to pay off everything," Ben said, his voice breaking as he stopped pacing and leaned against the counter. "She'll take care of your treatments, pay for Emily's college, even get me through law school." He hesitated, the next words catching in his throat. "But marriage? To someone I don't even know?" His mother set the mug down carefully, her frail hands gripping it as though it might shatter. Her tired eyes met his, filled with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Ben," she said softly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that lined her face. "I know this isn't what you dreamed of, but dreams don't keep the lights on. They don't pay for medication or tuition." Her words cut through him like a knife, each syllable a reminder of the harsh reality they lived in. She reached for his hand, her touch warm but fragile. "You've carried so much on your shoulders," she continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "If this is a way to lighten that burden, maybe it's worth considering." Ben sank into the chair opposite her, his head in his hands. He stared at the scratched surface of the table, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, his pride rebelled at the idea of surrendering his autonomy, of entering a marriage devoid of love or connection. On the other hand, the crushing reality of their situation loomed over him like a storm cloud. He thought of his mother's health, the worsening coughs she tried to hide, the mounting medical bills they could no longer ignore. He thought of Emily, his bright-eyed sister whose dreams of college and a better life had been put on hold indefinitely. And he thought of himself, caught in the relentless cycle of working, studying, and worrying with no end in sight. "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother shook her head slowly. "I think," she said gently, "that only you can decide what's right. But I also know that sometimes we have to make choices that don't feel fair because the alternative is worse." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Ben leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as he wrestled with the enormity of the decision before him. Was he truly willing to sacrifice his future, his sense of self, for the sake of his family? And if he didn't? What then? The room fell silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ben could feel the weight of his mother's gaze, her quiet strength, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. He paused, his voice faltering. I don't know if I can live with myself if I say yes, but I also don't know how I can live with myself if I say no. His mother reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Whatever you decide, she said softly, you won't face it alone. We'll get through this together, Ben. We always have. Her words brought a fleeting sense of solace, but they didn't resolve the conflict raging within him. That night, as the apartment settled into its usual quiet, Ben sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the dim glow of the streetlights outside the window. The decision he faced was no longer just about him. It was about his family, their future, and the impossible choice between pride and survival. And as the hours ticked by, Ben realized that whatever choice he made, his life would never be the same. Ben's uneasy new reality days passed, and while the physical comfort of Margaret's grand estate was undeniable, it did little to ease the knot of unease that had taken residence in Ben's chest. The mansion was nothing short of spectacular. A sprawling architectural masterpiece with intricate moldings, gilded accents, and polished marble floors that gleamed under the soft glow of chandelier light. Every room seemed designed to impress, from the library lined with leather-bound books to the sunroom where the morning light streamed through stained glass windows, painting the floor with hues of amber and ruby. But for all its beauty, the house felt lifeless, as though it were frozen in time. The grand hallways echoed with silence, the opulence seeming to mock him with its emptiness. It wasn't a home, it was a stage, pristine and unyielding, with Margaret at its center, commanding every scene. The staff moved like clockwork, their footsteps so light they barely registered on the marble floors. They appeared at precise intervals, delivering meals, tidying rooms, and disappearing just as swiftly. Their professionalism was flawless, but their silence unnerved Ben. He often caught them averting their gazes when he passed, as though he were an unwelcome intruder in their carefully maintained world. Meals were the most jarring part of Ben's new routine. The dining room table was a behemoth, its length so exaggerated that he wondered if it were designed to create distance rather than connection. He would sit at one end, the polished wood cool under his fingertips, while Margaret occupied the opposite seat, so far away that he sometimes had to lean forward to catch her words. One evening, as they sat in their usual places, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound between them, Margaret finally spoke. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her tone polite but detached, as if inquiring about a business arrangement rather than the life-altering upheaval she had caused. Ben hesitated, carefully placing his fork down. "It's different," he replied, his voice measured. The truth was far more complex, but he wasn't sure how much he could or should say. Margaret's faint smile appeared, fleeting and devoid of warmth. "You'll get used to it," she said simply, as though adjusting to this life was as straightforward as putting on a new coat. But Ben wasn't so sure. Every corner of the mansion seemed to carry an invisible weight, a sense of unfinished business that lingered like a shadow. He couldn't ignore the tension that simmered just beneath the surface of Margaret's composed exterior. There was a story here, something unspoken that hung in the air between them. At night, the silence of the estate was almost oppressive. Ben would wander the endless hallways, his footsteps echoing softly as he explored the labyrinth of rooms. He found himself drawn to the library more often than not, its shelves filled with books he could never imagine affording. He would sit for hours, flipping through pages without absorbing the words, his mind elsewhere. The more time he spent in the mansion, the more he noticed the small cracks in its veneer of perfection. The way Margaret's gaze lingered on certain portraits that lined the halls, her expression distant and unreadable. The locked door at the end of the west wing, its presence a constant whisper of something forbidden. The occasional muffled conversations between the staff that abruptly ceased the moment they noticed him nearby. And then there was Margaret herself. She was an enigma, a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering control. Yet there were moments when her polished facade slipped ever so slightly. A flash of sadness in her eyes, a pause in her speech, a tension in her hands as they gripped her wineglass. Ben began to wonder if Margaret's proposal had been about more than appearances. The thought unsettled him. He had entered this arrangement out of desperation, But it was becoming increasingly clear that Margaret had her own reasons she wasn't ready to share. One evening, as he stood on the balcony overlooking the expansive grounds, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass, Ben felt a pang of longing for his old life. It hadn't been easy, but at least it had been his. Here, in the grandeur of the estate, he felt like a piece on a chessboard, moved according to someone else's plan. Yet, despite his discomfort, he couldn't deny the opportunities this arrangement had provided. His mother's treatments had begun, her strength slowly returning. Emily had enrolled in college, her excitement evident in their phone calls, and for the first time in years, Ben wasn't lying awake at night wondering how they would make it through the month. Still, the question lingered. At what cost? As the days turned into weeks, Ben realized that his new reality was far from simple. Margaret's world was one of luxury, yes, but it was also a world of secrets, and he had only just begun to scratch the surface. The locked door. One sleepless night, Ben wandered the mansion's endless halls, the chill of the polished marble floors seeping through his thin socks. The grand estate, silent during the day, felt almost haunting in the dead of night. Every creak of the floorboards and faint whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified in the stillness. As he passed the library, a glint of light caught his eye, a faint shimmer bouncing off an ornate tea sitting atop the desk. Its design was intricate, the metalwork curling into elegant, almost floral shapes, as though it belonged to another era entirely. It seemed out of place amidst the modern sophistication of Margaret's carefully curated world. Ben stepped closer, his heart beating a little faster. Earlier that day, he had noticed a locked door at the end of the west wing. The key had caught his attention, but he hadn't thought much of it, until now. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. The key felt heavier than he expected, its weight solid and purposeful in his palm. A swirl of curiosity and unease churned in his gut. That door had seemed forbidden, its presence lingering in the back of his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. Ben hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though Margaret might appear behind him. The mansion was vast, its halls sprawling, yet he felt exposed, as if the walls themselves were watching him. The logical part of him urged him to put the key back, to walk away and let the door remain locked. But the unanswered questions pulled at him, stronger than reason. He made his way to the west wing, the quiet hum of the house broken only by his soft footsteps. The air grew colder as he approached the door, a faint draft seeping through the gaps in the frame. It stood at the end of a narrow corridor, its dark wood aged and worn, a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Ben hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob as doubt gnawed at him. What was he about to uncover? Did he truly want to know? The door creaked softly as it opened, revealing a room bathed in shadows. The faint moonlight streaming through a small dust-covered window illuminated the space in a pale, ghostly glow. Ben's breath hitched as he stepped inside. The room felt frozen in time, untouched for years. Dust coated every surface, muting the once vibrant colors of the faded wallpaper. Furniture sat eerily still, their edges softened by neglect. A chaise lounge, its upholstery torn in places, rested near a small table cluttered with scattered papers and tarnished frames holding faded photographs. Ben's gaze lingered on the photographs. They depicted a younger Margaret, her expression softer, almost unrecognizable. Beside her stood a man with a proud smile, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. He looked vaguely familiar, though Ben couldn't place why. His attention shifted to the table, where the scattered papers called to him. His fingers brushed against brittle parchment, lifting a letter with careful precision. The ink, though faded, was still legible. The words began to paint a story, a tangled web of failed business ventures and broken promises. Margaret's late husband had entered into a series of deals with none other than Ben's father, deals that had ultimately gone sour. Another letter caught Ben's eye, its crisp edges and bold handwriting standing out among the aged documents. It bore Margaret's name at the bottom, her signature unmistakable. "Your father's deceit ruined my family. He will pay, even if it's through his son." The words struck Ben like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. His hands trembled as he set the letter down, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on his shoulders, far greater than the burden he had carried before. This marriage, it wasn't about companionship or appearances or even mutual benefit. It was about revenge, a carefully orchestrated plan to make him, the son of the man who had wronged her, bear the cost of his father's mistakes. The room seemed to close in around him, the air heavy with dust and unspoken truths. Ben backed away from the table, his thoughts racing. He had agreed to this arrangement out of desperation, believing it to be a lifeline for his struggling family. But now, the very foundation of that decision felt like quicksand, pulling him deeper into a trap he hadn't seen coming. As he closed the door behind him, locking it once more, Ben's mind swirled with questions. What had really happened between Margaret and his father? Was there more to this story than the papers revealed? And most pressing of all, what would he do now? The ornate key felt cold in his pocket as he walked back to his room, the truth weighing heavily on him. For the first time, the grandeur of the mansion didn't feel intimidating. It felt suffocating. He wasn't just a guest here. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. But one thing was certain. The answers he sought wouldn't be found by running. If Margaret had brought him here to settle old scores, he would have to confront her and find out exactly what role he was meant to play in her carefully laid plans. The ripple effect of forgiveness. In the weeks following Margaret's decision to dismantle her schemes, the estate transformed in ways that Ben could scarcely believe. The suffocating silence that had once filled its halls was replaced with the sounds of life. The quiet laughter of the staff, the soft hum of a radio playing in the kitchen, and the gentle murmur of conversation echoing through the grand rooms. The change wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. The staff, who had once moved with rigid precision and avoided eye contact, now seemed to breathe easier. Their smiles were no longer forced, their interactions no longer clipped. Even the mansion itself seemed to awaken, its cold, empty spaces warming under the presence of genuine human connection. Margaret herself was a revelation. The woman who had once exuded control and calculation now carried a softer air. She spent hours in her study, but instead of plotting revenge or managing her estate's affairs, she immersed herself in acts of purpose. Letters were written, calls were made, and meetings were arranged. Slowly but surely, she began to channel her considerable wealth and influence toward causes that mattered. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for medical treatments, and community projects aimed at rebuilding lives. One morning, as Ben wandered the grounds, he found her in the garden. The once neglected rows of roses were beginning to bloom under her care, their vibrant colors a testament to her efforts. She knelt in the soil, her gloves stained with dirt, her focus entirely on pruning a particularly stubborn stem. It was a side of Margaret he hadn't seen before, unguarded, almost serene. The woman who had orchestrated a marriage as a tool of revenge now seemed at peace, her movements unhurried and deliberate. "You know," she said suddenly, not looking up from her work, "I never thought I'd find peace again." Her voice was quiet, reflective, as though she were speaking more to herself than to Ben. "For years, all I could think about was how to make the world feel the pain I felt. I thought if I could balance the scales, I'd finally be free of it." She straightened, brushing the dirt from her gloves, and turned to face him. "But now," she paused, her gaze drifting to the blooming roses. "Now, I think I see what I've been missing. All that anger, all that grief, it never gave me peace. It only chained me to the past." Ben stepped closer, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy to let go of something that's defined you for so long," he said, his tone gentle. "But you're doing it, Margaret. And it's not just changing your life, it's changing the lives of so many others." Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd met her. "I have you to thank for that," she said simply. Ben shook his head slightly. "I didn't do anything. This was all you." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That there's more strength in forgiveness than in holding on to anger. And that sometimes letting go is the only way to truly move forward." The garden seemed to breathe around them, the scent of roses filling the air as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable and unspoken. Margaret turned back to her roses, her movements deliberate and practiced. "These flowers were my husband's favorite," she said after a while. "He used to tend to them every morning, even when things were difficult. I let them wither after he passed. It felt like I was letting him wither too. But now they're blooming again," Ben said quietly. Margaret nodded, her eyes soft with a mix of sadness and hope. "Yes, and so am I." As Ben left the garden that morning, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for Margaret. She had faced her demons, wrestled with her pain, and chosen a path few would have the courage to take. And in doing so, she had not only transformed her own life, but also set into motion a ripple effect that would touch countless others. Forgiveness, Ben realized, wasn't just an act of letting go. It was a way of rebuilding, of planting seeds for a brighter future. And in Margaret's newfound purpose, he saw the quiet power of redemption taking root, growing stronger with each passing day. Building the Scholarship Fund. 6 months of tireless preparation culminated in the launch of the Margaret Hawthorne Scholarship Fund. The once grand ballroom of Margaret's estate, long a symbol of cold elegance, had been transformed into a space brimming with warmth and possibility. Strings of soft lights hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the room. Tables were adorned with modest but thoughtful decorations, arrangements of fresh flowers, each bouquet tied with a ribbon in the foundation's signature colors. Margaret and Ben stood together near the stage, greeting guests as they arrived. Among the attendees were community leaders, educators, potential benefactors, and most importantly, the first group of scholarship recipients. The young students, dressed in their best attire, radiated a mix of nervousness and excitement. As the room filled, Ben couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The Scholarship Fund was more than just a tribute to Margaret's late husband. It was a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. Margaret Hawthorne's legacy, once overshadowed by bitterness and loss, had been reclaimed as a force for good. The event began with a warm welcome from Margaret. Though her voice carried the poise of a seasoned speaker, there was a newfound softness in her tone. She spoke of Harold's vision, a world where opportunity wasn't dictated by wealth or privilege, and how the Scholarship Fund was a step toward realizing that dream. As she stepped aside to let Ben take the stage, she gave him an encouraging nod. The spotlight fell on him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. But as he began to speak, his nerves melted away, replaced by conviction. "This fund is not just about providing financial support," Ben said, his voice steady and clear. "It's about second chances. It's about proving that no matter what darkness we face, we can choose to rise above it and create light for others." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. The young recipients sat at the front, their eyes wide with hope and gratitude. "Each of you sitting here today is proof of that. You are the future, and it's our responsibility, our privilege, to invest in that future." Applause filled the room as Ben stepped down, his words resonating deeply with the audience. Margaret, seated in the front row, dabbed at her eyes discreetly with a handkerchief. For the first time in decades, she felt a sense of purpose that was untainted by anger or grief. As the evening continued, the atmosphere became one of celebration. Guests mingled, sharing stories and forging connections. The recipients of the scholarships were introduced one by one, their stories of resilience and ambition earning heartfelt applause. At one point, Margaret found herself speaking with a young woman named Clara, who had been awarded a scholarship to pursue a degree in environmental science. Clara's enthusiasm was infectious as she spoke of her dreams of restoring ecosystems and advocating for sustainability. "You remind me of someone," Margaret said, her voice thoughtful. "Who's that?" Clara asked, curious. Margaret smiled faintly. "My husband. Harold was always thinking about the future, about what he could do to leave the world better than he found it." As the evening wound down, Margaret and Ben stood together at the edge of the ballroom, watching the guests linger in conversations and laughter. "You know," Margaret said, her voice quiet, "for the longest time, I thought the past was all I had left. But tonight, I see a future worth building." Ben nodded, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just Harold's legacy, Margaret. It's yours too." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." The launch of the Harold Hawthorne Scholarship Fund marked more than the beginning of an initiative. It marked the start of a new chapter. The estate, once a monument to loss, had become a place of hope and transformation. And as Margaret and Ben watched the room buzz with energy, they knew they were part of something far greater than themselves. A ripple effect that would touch lives for generations to come. A final gesture. Months after the scholarship fund's launch, the estate had become a bustling hub of activity. What was once a symbol of isolation now overflowed with life and purpose. On any given day, the grand halls were filled with students attending mentorship sessions, professionals leading workshops, and volunteers organizing community events. The transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret found Ben in the study, poring over a stack of proposals for upcoming projects. His desk was cluttered with papers and notebooks, but his focus was unwavering. She approached quietly, holding a sealed envelope in her hand. "Ben," she said softly, her voice breaking his concentration. He looked up, startled but smiling when he saw her. "Margaret, what's this?" he asked, noticing the envelope she held out to him. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him with a sense of finality. Ben frowned slightly, his brow furrowing as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal documents. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. The papers outlined the full transfer of ownership of the estate to him. "Margaret, I don't understand," he stammered, looking up at her. "I don't need this anymore," Margaret explained, her tone calm but resolute. "I've found a smaller house closer to the city, where I can focus on the scholarship and live simply. The estate is too much for me now." Ben stared at her, stunned. The weight of her gesture left him momentarily speechless. "Margaret, I can't. This house, it's your home. It's your history." She interrupted him with a gentle but firm wave of her hand. "It hasn't felt like home for a long time, Ben," she admitted, her voice tinged with quiet reflection. "For years it was a monument to my anger and grief, but you've helped change that. Now it's become a place of hope and transformation. That's what it should be, a space that serves others, not a reminder of my mistakes." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ben could see the truth in her eyes. The estate, for all its grandeur, no longer held the same significance for her. Though reluctant at first, Ben eventually accepted, understanding the depth of Margaret's decision. The estate became the official headquarters for the Harold Hawthorne Scholarship Fund, a place where dreams were nurtured and lives were changed. Under Ben's stewardship, the estate continued to evolve. The once formal ballroom was converted into a multi-purpose space for workshops and events. The library became a resource center, stocked with textbooks, career guides, and laptops for students. Even the garden, once neglected, now thrived as a peaceful retreat for those seeking inspiration or solace. The laughter of children echoed through the halls during weekend programs, and the buzz of conversations filled the air as mentors and students exchanged ideas. What had once been a cold, imposing mansion was now a sanctuary of growth and opportunity. One evening, as Ben walked through the estate, he paused in the garden. The roses Margaret had tended were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a reminder of the transformation that had taken place. He thought of her words that morning when she handed him the envelope. "This house should be a place of hope, not a reminder of my mistakes." She had been right. The estate was no longer a monument to the past. It was a beacon for the future. That night, Ben wrote her a letter. "Margaret, this house is no longer yours, but your presence is felt in every corner of it. Every laugh, every conversation, every new opportunity that starts here is because of you. You didn't just give me the estate. You gave me a chance to continue what you and Harold started. And for that, I will always be grateful." Margaret received the letter a few days later, reading it in the quiet of her new home. She smiled softly, her heart full. For the first time in decades, she felt a sense of peace, not because she had let go of her past, but because she had chosen to rewrite its ending. The ripple effect of her gesture extended far beyond what she could have imagined. The estate, once a symbol of grief, now stood as a testament to redemption, resilience, and the power of second chances. A letter from Margaret. A year after the transformation of the estate and the launch of the Harold Hawthorne Scholarship Fund, Margaret's health began to wane. It started with small things. Moments of fatigue she couldn't shake, a persistent cough that refused to subside. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to age. But as the months passed, it became clear that something deeper was at play. The once strong woman who had commanded every room she entered now spent more time resting in the cozy sunlit corners of her new home. Yet, even as her physical strength faded, her resolve remained steadfast. She continued to oversee the fund, write letters to donors, and follow the stories of the students who had been given a chance through the scholarships. One evening, as the autumn leaves began to fall, Margaret sat at her desk, a pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper before her. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth a welcome comfort against the chill creeping into her bones. She took a deep breath and began to write, her words flowing with a quiet sense of purpose. Ben, I've spent most of my life chasing things that could never heal me. I thought that power, revenge, and wealth would fill the void left by grief, but I was wrong. In the end, it wasn't those things that brought me peace. It was forgiveness. Forgiveness for others and for myself. And the chance to do something meaningful with what I had left. You gave me that chance. You reminded me that it's never too late to change the story we're writing for ourselves. For that, I will always be grateful. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know this, I'm finally content. The weight I carried for so many years has lifted, and for the first time in decades I feel free, and I owe that to you. Keep building. Keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep forgiving. The world needs more of that. Margaret folded the letter carefully, slipping it into an envelope addressed to Ben. She placed it on her bedside table, knowing that one day soon it would find its way into his hands. Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep a few months later. The news, though not unexpected, still hit Ben like a tidal wave. He had been by her side in her final days, holding her hand as she drifted into a peaceful slumber from which she never woke. The funeral was a small, intimate affair, attended by the many lives she had touched, the students whose futures she had changed, the staff who had come to see her as more than an employer, and the benefactors who had admired her transformation, all gathered to pay their respects. As Ben stood by her grave, the letter she had written to him clutched tightly in his hand. He felt an overwhelming mix of grief and gratitude. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the journey they had shared and the lessons she had imparted. Later that evening, back at the estate, Ben sat alone in the study. The letter lay open before him, its contents a testament to Margaret's wisdom and strength. He traced the elegant script with his fingers, the weight of her words settling deep in his heart. Keep building, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep forgiving. Those words became his mantra in the months that followed. Ben poured himself into the work of the scholarship fund, ensuring that Margaret's legacy would endure. Under his leadership, the fund expanded to offer mentorship programs, community outreach initiatives, and partnerships with organizations that aligned with Margaret's vision of creating a better world. The estate, now vibrant with activity and purpose, became a symbol of what Margaret had stood for in her final years: hope, redemption, and the power of second chances. Years later, during a ceremony celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Margaret Hawthorne Scholarship Fund, Ben stood before a crowd of students, benefactors, and community members. As he addressed them, Margaret's letter rested in his pocket, a constant reminder of the woman who had shown him the power of forgiveness. Margaret Hawthorne taught me that it's never too late to rewrite our stories, he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. She believed in the power of change, in the strength it takes to turn pain into purpose. And because of her, we're here today, creating opportunities and building a future where dreams can thrive. The room erupted into applause, but Ben's gaze drifted to the portrait of Margaret that hung on the wall. Her eyes, captured with a quiet determination, seemed to watch over the room. "Thank you, Margaret," he whispered under his breath, "for everything." Her letter remained with him for the rest of his life, a symbol of the lessons she had left behind. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a call to action, a reminder to carry her legacy forward and to continue building a world shaped by forgiveness and hope. Carrying the legacy forward. Years had passed, but the memory of Margaret Hawthorne and the profound impact she had left on countless lives remained as vivid as ever. Ben stood in the same grand ballroom where the Harold Hawthorne Scholarship Fund had been launched, now transformed into a vibrant and welcoming space. The walls were adorned with photographs of past scholarship recipients, students who had gone on to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and community leaders. Each picture told a story of resilience, of lives forever changed by the opportunities Margaret's vision had created. Ben looked out at the sea of faces before him, a new generation of hopeful students, their expressions a mix of nervous anticipation and excitement. Their families sat behind them, their pride evident in every glance and tearful smile. This moment was a testament to the power of a single act of transformation, the ripple effect of Margaret's decision to forgive and rebuild. Clearing his throat, Ben stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice, steady and warm, carried through the room. Margaret Hawthorne taught me that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about using it to build a better future, he began, his gaze sweeping across the audience. She turned her pain into a gift for the world, and in doing so, she gave us a blueprint for what it means to truly live with purpose. Today, this fund stands as a testament to her belief in second chances, not just for herself, but for all of us. Applause broke out, heartfelt and genuine. Many in the audience wiped their eyes, moved by the weight of his words. Among them sat recipients from years past, their success stories now inspiring the next wave of scholars. Ben paused, letting the applause fade before continuing. Each of you here today represents more than just potential. You represent hope. You are proof that with the right opportunities, barriers can be broken and lives can be changed. And as you take the next steps in your journey, I urge you to remember Margaret's lesson, that even in the face of hardship, we have the power to transform our pain into something meaningful. He gestured toward a portrait of Margaret hanging on the far wall. The artist had captured her in her later years, her silver hair framing a face lined with wisdom and softened by kindness. The inscription beneath read, "A legacy of forgiveness, hope, and transformation." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her legacy settling over everyone present. Then, a young woman in the front row stood and spoke. "My name is Alina," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'm here because of Margaret Hawthorne and this scholarship fund. Without it, I wouldn't be graduating as the first doctor in my family. She changed my life, and I'll carry her legacy with me every day." The room erupted into applause once more, the sound echoing through the ballroom. Ben smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Alina's story was one of many, and each one was a reminder of why this work mattered. As the ceremony concluded, Ben found himself surrounded by students and alumni, eager to share their stories and express their gratitude. He listened intently, his heart full as he heard how the fund had opened doors, healed wounds, and sparked dreams. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Ben lingered in the ballroom. The lights had dimmed, and the room was quiet, save for the faint echo of voices and laughter still hanging in the air. He walked over to the portrait of Margaret, his steps slow and deliberate. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You were right. Redemption isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something better in its place. And because of you, so many lives are better now." He stood there for a moment longer, the weight of gratitude and purpose settling over him. The choices he had made, the decision to confront his past, to forgive, and to stay, had led to something far greater than he could have imagined. Margaret's legacy was alive, not just in the scholarship fund, but in every life it had touched and every dream it had made possible. And as Ben left the ballroom that night, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The work was far from over, but that was the beauty of it. Margaret's legacy wasn't a story with an ending. It was a story still being written, one life at a time. Personal reflection. This story is a testament to the power of transformation. Margaret's journey from vengeance to forgiveness shows us that no matter how far we've gone down a dark path, there's always a way back. Ben's courage to confront her and his commitment to turning pain into purpose remind us that we all have the ability to create change, even in the most difficult circumstances. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories 365. Let's continue spreading messages of hope, forgiveness, and transformation. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of second chances and the strength of forgiveness, we invite you to join our growing community. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Margaret's journey inspired you the most? Spread this message of hope by sharing this video with your friends and family. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to join us at Life Stories 365. Each week, we bring you inspiring stories of resilience, transformation, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Together, let's continue to share these lessons and uplift one another. Stay tuned for our next story, because everyone deserves to be reminded of the beauty in second chances.